Seamless helmet mold using TC5130F platinum silicone. This is part one of a multi-part video series on molding this Halo helmet. This was provided to me by Rhino Props out of Dallas, Texas. And I mainly wanted to show a part like this because this is a 3D printed part that has some unusual things about it and presents some unique challenges. And ultimately, this is going to be for rotational casting on a rotational casting machine. So this necessitates a little bit different mold than we would do for something that's going to be cast by hand. Now in part one, the part you're watching now, I'll be making the silicone mold over the 3D printed helmet. And then I'll be following that up in part two with the support shell or mother mold. And I'll do that using a hard resin material. I'll be doing that with the BR75D brushable resin formula. And also in part two, I'll be showing how I make the cap for the bottom of the mold that has a little fill hole that allows for easy filling when we're putting this on a rotational casting machine. And then of course, we'll be taking a little road trip or field trip to Dallas, Texas to do some casting with the finished mold. So stay tuned for all that. But right now, let's get to it with part one and the making of the silicone mold. Now, the first thing I need to do before I can apply my silicone, of course, is to mount this to a board and, of course, clay up any of the tricky areas like that visor. That visor, since it created a massive hollow area, I filled that in just like the clear visor will ultimately be in the finished helmet with some Van Aken soft Protolina clay. And of course, I'll link to all of the materials I use in the video description, so be sure to check out all of those links below. But that comes in slabs that are about 3/4 of an inch thick or so, and they're perfect for this kind of work like this. So we can just take these slabs and bend them around, and what I want is to create a little standoff at the bottom of the helmet so that I raise it up from the baseboard about an inch or so at the back, and a little bit closer at the front where the chin of the helmet is. And the reason I want to raise that up a little bit is so that I can get under to those little detailed parts a little bit easier. If it's right flat on that mounting board, on that foam core board, it's going to be really hard to get that silicone into those areas. And then the other thing I want to plan for is this little area that I'm claying up ultimately will become a little silicone cap that fits inside and secures this when we're casting. Since, again, this is going to be on a rotational casting machine, we want to make sure that ultimately we can close up the entire mold so it can rotate without leaking resin. Now what I'm doing here is mixing up some TC300 6-pound rigid foam to pour inside this helmet. I wanted to do this in several batches, and I'm not going to show all that just for time's sake, but what I'm doing is mixing that up and pouring that into that helmet just a small batch at a time to gradually fill this up so I can take out that hollow void inside and make this easier to flip over and mount on that board. And that will also stabilize that clay that I put into that visor so everything will be secure when I start putting silicone on. Because the last thing you want to happen is be halfway through this mold and have that visor fall into the 3D print. Now, what I'm doing here at the base is just adding a little bit more clay to flare out that little base, that little seat that I've made of clay. And I want to make sure that's as nice and pretty as possible because, again, later on, that's going to become part of the mold. That everything in clay that you see there will actually be in silicone in the finished mold. Now, one thing I'm not going to show in this video is I did run a test cure against this pattern to make sure that it was compatible with platinum silicone. And if you're unfamiliar with that process, definitely check out my video. I'll link it on the end screen about testing for cure inhibition. So check that out. I'll put that at the end of the video. But real important, make sure your pattern is compatible with the silicone you're using for your mold. Now here I'm releasing the pattern with Zip 301 mold release. Also important, this is a compatible mold release for making silicone molds. Then I'm going to set that aside and let that dry. And I usually let that dry for at least 30 minutes, 45 minutes or so before I start applying my silicone. Now, as I mentioned in the introduction that I posted earlier, this is going to be a brush-on mold, and I'm going to do this in several layers. And the first 2 layers I'm going to put on with no thickener added. I want these to be really runny, to run all over the part and capture all of that really fine, intricate detail. So I'm just mixing up about 400 grams, so 200 grams of part A, 200 grams of part B, and TC5130F. This is the fast formula. So I really like it for this kind of application because the longer setting formula, it has about a 30-minute working time, and to me that's a little bit too long for that really runny print coat because you wind up with a lot of it running off your pattern. And now what I'm doing is adding a little bit of silicone pigment to that batch. And the reason for that is just so I can see where it's going, because by itself, the 5130F is translucent. So by adding a little bit of pigment to it, it makes it a little bit more obvious where we're putting our silicone. Again, that's totally optional, purely cosmetic. It does help you see, though, where you're putting your silicone. So once I've got that mixed in, I'm ready to pour some of that into that little key sheet before applying the rest to the master. Now, this is a really important detail that you want to pour these keys fresh before each mold. That way you have a really good bond between those keys and the silicone. Now, TC5130F, it has a working time of 7 to 8 minutes at room temperature, and then a demold time of about an hour, hour and a half. So plenty of time to get everything thoroughly mixed and poured into the key sheet and brushed all over our master. So really nice working time with this silicone. You have more than enough time to vacuum degas if you need to for large poured molds, and like I'm doing here where we're pouring this into a key sheet first before we start applying our silicone. But again, remember when you're working with the slower formula of 5130, that one has about a 30-minute working time, and for this kind of process, you could easily wind up with a lot of wasted silicone just running down off your workbench. So with the F formula or the fast formula, that 7 to 8 minute working time is perfect for this because we have just enough time to get our pattern coated with a thin layer or print coat of silicone, but not so much time that we start having all of the silicone run off of our pattern. Now with a mold like this, be prepared to get down on the floor looking up at the part so you make sure you don't have any little bare spots that you didn't notice from standing up. So good idea to get all around the pattern, and depending on what your part is made of and how it's mounted to your baseboard, sometimes if you can even flip it upside down, that will help also. But here we're just going through making sure every part of this helmet is covered. And then once I have total coverage of that print coat all over that 3D printed pattern, then I'm going to focus on making a very wide flange. And if you missed the introduction where I was talking about mold planning, I explained the purpose of that flange in that video. And the whole point of this, we want a really nice wide flange, so we'll have something to seat the underside of the mold to, but also so we have something to grab onto when we demold that silicone jacket off of the cast parts, because that does require a little bit of manhandling to pull that off that finished pattern and off those resulting resin casts. So you want to have a nice wide flange when you're working with a one-piece seamless mold like this so that you have something to really grab onto. Now again, our working time is 7 to 8 minutes at room temperature, so you want to let it just sit there for a little bit and let any of those little drips come off of it, and we're going to come back and cut those off here in just a minute. But typically, the time to recoat between layers like this is about 30 minutes. And here what I'm using is my index finger, my fingernail, just to tap that edge on the outside of that flange area. And once it's tacky, but it doesn't come off on my fingernail, that's a good indicator we're ready to apply more silicone. You don't want to apply more silicone when that silicone, you can still move it around a little bit or any of it's coming off on your finger. You want to make sure it's at least stable enough and gelled enough to the point that you can add more without disturbing that print coat. Now here I'm using a scissors to cut away any of those little drips, and you want to be really careful when you're doing this not to touch the silicone so that you don't cause any delamination between layers from oil from your hand transferring to that silicone. So real important, you want to move as fast as possible between these layers so you get a really good bond between those layers of silicone. Now this is my second batch, and this batch I'm mixing up again 5130 1:1 with some silicone pigment. And again, this can be mixed by weight or volume, so very versatile, easy to use silicone formula, and I'm also not adding any thickener yet. And you'll find when you're working with really detailed parts that have a lot of really intricate, deep detail, sometimes it's helpful to do multiple thin print coats with no thickener added so that you make sure you get no air entrapment on that detailed surface. And that's one of those things, there's no right or wrong answer to that. It's very part specific. So just remember, with a brush on mold like this, sometimes you will need to modify your technique to fit the pattern that you're molding. Now, it's important to also be very gentle when you're applying these print coats because especially the second coat, you don't want to bear down on this too much and risk creating little blisters on that first thin layer of silicone that you've already applied. So you want to take care and just let gravity do a lot of that work for you. And again, remember the time between coats, typically when you're working in a room temperature environment of say 70 to 75 degrees, typically you can apply a new layer about every 30 minutes or so. Now, once I've got all of that applied, I'm ready to let that sit and gel. And 30 minutes later, we're ready for our first layer of thickened silicone. So this is actually layer number 3. And we'll be thickening this using the SC5001 thickening agent. So again, we've got our 5130F silicone mixed 1:1, and I've added silicone pigment to this. This time I've added more blue and a little bit of white to it, and I'm thickening it with the SC5001 thickening agent. And I'm adding about 1%. So this was about a 1,000-gram batch, so I'm adding about 10 grams of the SC5001 thickening agent. Now, when you add that 1% thickener, you're going to get a really thick frosting-like paste. And that's perfect for building up the thickness of the mold. And real important with a brush on mold, and if you've followed my videos for a while, you've probably heard me already say this a few times, but you don't want to think in terms of how many coats you're applying of silicone. This isn't like latex where it needs to air dry. So there are times when you could apply silicone 1/4 of an inch or a 1/2 inch in one layer if you have enough of the thickener added to this. But the main point of multiple layers is to minimize air entrapment. So what we're going for ultimately is a total thickness of about 1/4 of an inch to 3/8 of an inch on average will make a good sturdy brush on mold. So again, you don't want to think so much in terms of how many coats, but in the overall thickness that you're going to wind up with. Because you could easily just put on 5 or 6 paper thin coats, but that's not going to make a nice tough mold. Now, I'm going in here starting at the bottom this time. Usually with those runny coats with no thixo added, I put those on the top and let gravity pull that into the detail. But when we add a lot of thickener like this, when it's behaving more like a thick paste, I like to start at the bottom and work up. And that way I don't have any of that fall onto an area and create air entrapment. So I'm just gradually working up, filling in those areas, and this is where I can start to simplify my form. And that's a real important step with a silicone brush on mold like this, is you want to start simplifying your form and filling in some of those undercut areas. And this is one of those times when it's okay to break that rule of that overall thickness of 1/4 of an inch to 3/8 of an inch, because sometimes filling in an undercut area, you might actually build it up to maybe an inch or so thick of silicone to fill a really deep void. It all just depends on the subject that you're molding and whether or not that's going to be appropriate for the casting that you're going to be doing later on. Now again, we want to be conscious of our working time, and this has a long enough working time. That 7 to 8 minute working time, in my opinion, that is perfect for this, because we got enough time that you can get everything mixed up and with time to spare and get it properly applied without feeling too rushed. But if you need something with a longer working time, you could use the regular 5130 that has that 30-minute working time. But again, I would not use that on the print coats just because you'll wind up with a lot of wasted silicone just running off of your part. Now here I'm just going in and I'm getting down on the floor, looking up at the part, making sure I've filled in all those undercut areas and all those little overhangs, making sure they're all coated. And with the remaining silicone, I'm brushing that around the base and to thicken up that flange again. And you'll notice there, right where the helmet meets the baseboard, I'm filling that in and kind of simplifying that edge and filling in some of those undercut areas and beveling those off. And the whole point of this is ultimately this will have a resin mother mold over the top. And we don't want any undercut areas that will snag on that resin mother mold as that's being removed and cause a lock between our cast part and our resin shell. So real important, we want to simplify the form, but the balancing act, because this is going to be a one-piece silicone mold that will peel off like a glove, we don't want this to be too thick, or we'll actually be working against the thickness of the mold when we start trying to demold our part. So real important to stay in that range of that overall thickness of 1/4 of an inch to 3/8 of an inch tops. And now this is another thickened batch, but I'm not putting as much thixo in this batch as I did the previous batch. I want this to be a little bit runny to smooth everything out after that brush on layer. So this I put probably about maybe 1/4% or so into this batch, because again, I do want this to run just a little bit. And again, I'm adding silicone pigment to this, and that just helps me track my progress. And when you're making these multi-layered molds like this, adding a little bit of silicone pigment really helps a lot in making sure that you're getting good total coverage with each batch. Now, again, once that's mixed in, we're ready to start brushing that on, and you'll see what I mean by the thickener added to this. By backing off the thickener a little bit, this is going to flow more than that previous layer. And the main reason I'm doing this is so that this will smooth everything out, and then I can apply a layer that's just for filling in undercuts. So this is going to build up the thickness of our mold and give us a little bit more strength, and also kind of level it all out, because ultimately I want the outside surface of this helmet to be as smooth as possible. And you'll see that even though that it does have the thixotropic additive in it, it is running a little bit so that it does kind of gloss over and create that kind of self-leveling effect. And that's perfect for this coat, where we want to just smooth everything out and start evening out the outside surface of the mold. And just remember that you don't want to stick to a certain strict set of rules for how you're making brush-on molds, because depending on what the pattern is made of, if it's clay, a 3D print, or some other material, you want to be prepared to adjust accordingly to whatever you're molding. But remember, overall, one of the most important things to bear in mind as you're making a brush-on mold like this with multiple layers of silicone is getting these layers to bond to each other. And the best way to make sure that they're all going to stick together is to do this as soon as possible, and make sure you're working in a clean area that does not have overspray of release agent that could land and settle on the part in between layers of silicone. So you get the best bond between those layers when you do that as soon as possible. Now, this is going to be a batch just to fill in some of those deep undercuts. So here we're going back to a 1% thickener to make this as thick as possible. And this time I've mixed up a smaller batch. This is about 400 grams, 200 grams of A, 200 grams of B, and again I'm adding more red silicone pigment. And then, of course, that 1% of the SC5001 thickener. So this is going to make this a really thick frosting-like paste. And I'm mixing up a smaller batch because I'm just going to be applying this in a few key areas. And the reason I'm doing this just in those spots is I don't need this thick all over right now. At this point, I've about got the thickness I need for my mold. So I don't want to make this any thicker than it absolutely has to be, because I want to make sure it's easy to demold. I'm just going to come into some of these lower areas and smooth those out and fill in any undercuts like in that visor area to make sure that ultimately that mother mold doesn't have any places it's going to snag on coming off of this. Because my mother mold, ultimately that will divide in two pieces right down the left and right sides of the head. So I want to make sure that each side is free of any undercuts or areas where that resin might snag on the 3D print underneath the silicone. And you see how I'm beveling that using a popsicle stick. You can use a palette knife like you saw me do in a previous video. All of that works really good for smoothing this out. But again, the main thing you want to do with this layer is filling in those deep undercuts and smoothing it out and beveling all those edges so you don't have any right angles that could catch on that mother mold that you're going to make with resin over the top. Now, once I've filled in all my little undercut areas, I'm just going to use the remaining silicone, just smear that out and level out the top as much as I can. But real important, I'm going to go back with that popsicle stick to all those little areas and try to get those as smooth as possible, because I have one layer left and my final layer is going to be like that original print coat. I'm going to mix up a layer with little to no thixo in it. Again, this is one of those judgment calls that you got to make based on the part. For this part, I'm not going to be putting any thixo at all, but there are times when you might want to put in just a little bit so you don't have too much of it, of the silicone, run off the part. So once I get that all smoothed out, I'm ready for that final layer of silicone. And again, really important, I can't stress this enough, that you want to do all of these coats as soon as possible and as close together as possible so that you get a good bond between all of these layers, and especially the keys. Last time we saw that key sheet was almost 20 minutes ago, but in real time that was cast up about maybe 4 hours prior to this layer. So now we're going to mix up that final layer of silicone, and we're going to pop out those little blister keys that I poured up at the beginning of the video, and then we're going to embed those on the outside of this final coat. So again, I've got my silicone mixed up, ready to brush on, and this batch is TC5130F platinum silicone, and of course pigment added. And if you want, you can add some of the SC5001. This layer I actually didn't put any of the thickening agent in it, but if you need it to have a little bit more hang to it, you could add a little bit to that coat. But the whole point of this is kind of a beauty coat to level everything out and add just that last little bit of thickness we need for our mold. And you want to move fast because you want to be able to make sure that you get your keys embedded in that outside flange. Now for this mold, this is a 25 Shore A silicone. The 5130F is around a 25A. So it holds its form pretty well, even without the mother mold on it. Obviously we're going to be using that mother mold for casting, but it holds its shape well enough that we don't need to put keys actually on the part. And real important there, you want to be very careful in your key placement, because if you start putting keys just willy-nilly all over the outside of your part, if for some reason those get misaligned and you don't have a good way to anchor those with cotter pins or whatever, you're going to wind up with little indentations and deformations in your cast. So for this, we're just applying our keys to the outside flange. Now, real important, don't touch those keys on the surface. Be very careful not to touch the surface of those keys that's facing up. And the reason for that is the oils from your fingers can transfer onto that silicone and cause delamination later. Not a huge deal, but I have seen times when people were handling it all willy-nilly and might have had some release residue on their hands, and you wound up with little keys that would pop off later on. So important to use fresh keys and make a point of not touching the tops of those keys. That exposed silicone, if you touch that too much, or any at all sometimes, you could wind up with delamination later on. So I always pour up a fresh set of keys before I make any kind of mold like this, and any leftover keys, because those will cure completely and they won't bond as well, go ahead and throw them away. And I know that's sad, but throw those away so you don't wind up accidentally using those later on. Now, if your initials are BZ and you work in the BJB warehouse, I have your razor knife. This somehow got stretch wrapped into a load of material I got from BJB actually well over a year or so ago, and so now I have this dude's razor knife. So we're using BZ's knife here to clean up that flange and just cut away the excess silicone. And again, I'm leaving that flange nice and wide because we're going to use that kind of like a handle later on. So we're just going to cut that away with that razor knife. And now we are ready to segue into our mother mold. Now, as usual, all of the material links will be in the video description, so be sure to check those out. And stick around for part 2. In part 2, I will be making a 3-part resin mother mold and also a silicone cap for the base of this part. So stick around for that. That will be posted soon enough, so check for that. And if you didn't watch the introduction, go back and watch that, because I talk a lot about the mold planning that's involved in a mold like this in that video. Now on the end screen here, I've got some additional resources for you about cure inhibition and basic brush-on mold, so check those out. And of course, as always, if you haven't already, be sure to like and subscribe, and of course, click the little bell icon so you get notified when I post new content. And thanks for watching.